but this was a significant uptick in scrutiny and the microscope that he would have to operate under. So while everybody praised the hire for sure, there was a certain level of skepticism. Hello and welcome in. It is always college football. Today is Monday, January 27th, and I'm your host, Greg McElroy. We appreciate you being here. We have a very interesting show for you today. We're going to go back through and revisit all the first-year coaches from this past season. We're going to give them a couple of different marks. We're going to go through what it was like when they were hired, what happened after they were hired, and basically the portal impact of what their team might look like. We'll take you through the season, then we'll give you an overall grade. So a lot that we need to go through today and a few things that I need to explain before we dive in to these coaches' assessments. But before I do that, kindly ask all of you to subscribe to the show wherever you get the show on the podcast platform. If you could subscribe, that'd be very, very appreciated. We love you guys, and we appreciate so much all the support that you've shown us here over the last few years. And then if you're here with us via the ESPN College Football YouTube channel, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button. We got a good show coming for you. So even if you feel like it's too premature to give the thumbs up, we're only a minute into the show, you can do it. It's going to be good. And if you don't like what we're doing here in 10 minutes or so, just go ahead and you can click it again, remove the thumbs up. That's fine. Either way, but we appreciate you being here. Couple things that I need to make sure that you understand. Our coaching grades on our show are going to be a little different from that of what you're going to get, because we try to consider all the different parts of your first year as head coach. It's not so much about wins and losses all the time. While that's important, wins and losses are the most important thing. And as we continue to evaluate these coaches, those wins and losses will factor more heavily into their year one coaching assessment. But we also have to take into account, what did they inherit and what were the challenges when they were first on the job. Part of the way we take that into account is by evaluating the portal departures and the portal gains, notable players that left and notable players that arrived, and how that might have factored in. We'll look at the total number of guys that left via the portal, the total number of guys that were brought in the portal, to help mitigate any of the roster imbalances that these teams might have had. So we will do that. And like I said, it's going to be a little bit different. The way we assess portal, we'll do a net portal. I'll tell you the amount of guys that left, amount of guys that came. Then we'll do a net portal effect on a scale of 1 to 10. 1, meaning you actually improved in the portal. 10, meaning that this coach had an impossible situation with some of the pieces that they left. So portal extremism is going to be something that's near the 10 side. And then if your team got better because of the portal, down near 1. So that's how we'll affect it, and I'll explain it as we move along. So let's dive in, and we will go in alphabetical order, starting with the last name Bray, the head coach of the Oregon State Beavers. Like I said, we'll go in alphabetical order based on the coach's last name. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, O is not in front of A, I understand that. Oregon State is where we'll kick things off with Trent Bray, B-R-A-Y. That is the first of the coaches here in alphabetical order. He got the job, was elevated from defensive coordinator, first-time head coach. Tough spot to step into, I might add, because at this point, you think back to last year, Jonathan Smith leaves. Who can blame him? Jonathan Smith got paid a ton of money to go be the head coach of Michigan State. Totally support that move. Totally get that move. Hard to leave your alma mater. But, man, the timing couldn't have been worse for Oregon State, trying to figure out, all right, what do we got to do, man? The Pac-12's 2 teams. We don't even know who's joining. We don't know what our situation's going to be like here in a couple years. But I do think the stability that was created by elevating Trent Bray made sense. He had deep roots in the program, and at least there was some level of continuity from the previous staff. He also was remarkably popular amongst Oregon State faithful. So that's what they were saying when he got the job. And then he lost 22 guys in the portal. Now, they brought in 12 to help fill that void, but man, the guys that they brought in were nowhere near the guys that they lost. Think about some of the notable departures in the portal. Damian Martinez, running back. went to Miami, had a great year. DJ Uiagalelei, who was great a couple years ago, wasn't great at Florida State, but he leaves. That's your starting quarterback. You also lose your backup quarterback, Aiden Childs, who goes on to become the Michigan State quarterback this season. You lose Jermod McCoy, who was the best cover corner for Tennessee, another team that was in the playoff mix. And then you lose Silas Bolden, who was a very important piece at times for the Texas Longhorns. So like I said, they brought in 12, but they couldn't possibly fill the void of the guys that had departed because of Jonathan Smith's departure. So as a result, and I told you this will be something that might require some level of explanation. On a scale of 1 to 10, Oregon State's portal situation last year was a 7. Now remember, 1 means you actually got better. 5 means that it's about the same. What you brought in was about the same as what you lost. And then 10 means that what you lost was completely irreplaceable. So it's a 5-alarm fire. I think Oregon State's situation was around a 7. It was pretty bad. They brought in some good players and some guys that could go and kind of help steady the ship. But to lose Damian Martinez and Uiagalelei and Childs and Jermod McCoy, like losing that quality of players is going to be impossible. So I give their portal rating a 7, which is not great. Pretty bad, to be honest with you. And year one record at 5-7, not great. Okay, we know that Bray was obviously very knowledgeable about the place. He had been on the staff. It was a difficult time to step in. They start the season really, really well. They're out the gate, sitting there at 4-1. So things are looking pretty good there at the midway point. And then kind of fell off a bit of a cliff. They lost 6 of their final 7 games. However, their one win in that home stretch came against Washington State, and that was the Pac-12 matchup of the year. So their defense struggled, and I think that's what's most troubling is that Trent Bray is a defensive guy. He was elevated from the defensive coordinator spot, and their defense gave up nearly 400 yards a game. So they have to be better with his expertise because that is not what you're looking for. So overall, year one grade for Trent Bray, I'm going to give him a C+. Moving down in the Pac-12, we'll go over to Arizona. Of course, no longer in the Pac-12. Now Arizona steps into the Big 12 and things got a lot tougher. Brennan takes over. And this is what they're saying. Hey, he's a good coach. He almost got the job last time. He's going to put together a really good staff. He's going to be great from a relationship standpoint with the roster. He's going to be able to bridge the gap because it was tough to see the success that Jedd Fisch had and then to see him leave so soon, so quickly. It was going to be a difficult spot to be in. And then the portal opened up, and they lost 26 guys in the portal, including Damon Williams, who went on to become Washington's starting quarterback down the stretch, Jonah Coleman, who went on to become Washington's starting running back from start to finish, who had a great year, by the way, and a couple of defensive linemen that are impossible to replace in Savea and Norton, both of which went to Texas to become starters. They brought in 15 guys, so they did an adequate job backfilling, but it wasn't good enough. I think their net portal was around a 6. So not even. They lost a little more than they got back, but they did an adequate job of kind of being able to keep and hang on to a couple of guys in Noah Fafita and Tetairoa McMillan to make the portal departures don't feel quite as bad, if you will. Then the season started and it wasn't good whatsoever. The year one record was 4-8. So it felt good after Jedd Fisch left to go and hire a coach that had some ties to the program. Brennan had spent some time around Dick Tomei, so he had kind of been around the program at its height and had done a pretty good job. He was not going to be a guy like Jedd Fisch that viewed Arizona as a stepping stone. This felt like a program that could move into the Big 12 and have immediate success. They had a solid core returning from a team that won 10 games. You had a couple of superstars potentially, one that was in Tetairoa McMillan at wide receiver. Then you had the quarterback in Noah Fafita that had done a really good job down the stretch in 2023. And then the Big 12, it was just a really challenging year for them. 2-7 in the Big 12. They finished tied for 14th. They did go on the road and beat Utah, but at the time, that win felt better than what it actually was. That Utah team ended up not being so great. They also had a bunch of different guys that were reassigned either during the season or after the season. So all the three coordinators, special teams, offense, and defense, no longer there. So this was a really difficult year for Brent Brennan in year number one. I give his year one grade a D+. Syracuse went and hired Fran Brown last year, and it wasn't a massive surprise. There were a lot of very interested coaches that looked at Syracuse and thought, all right, I can win here. It was actually a highly coveted job when Dino Babers was let go. So when they got Brown, it was a little bit surprising because it wasn't a lot of head coaching experience. There was a lot of sitting head coaches that were going after this job. So to go and get a guy that really was known more for his recruiting prowess than being a guy that was excellent from a coaching standpoint is something that I don't think anybody really knew. It was a bit of a dice roll, and it worked out great because even though he'd never been a coordinator, even though he'd never been a head coach, he had done a great job in making sure that he could upgrade the talent on the roster, and he did so immediately. We'll look at the portal here because this was significant. Yes, they lost 20 guys in the portal when he was hired. All 20 of those guys were 3 stars, okay? Well, he brought in 17, but amongst those 17 guys that he brought in 11 3-stars, he brought in 5 4-stars, and he brought in a 5-star. I mean, he went out and he upgraded their situation at some premier positions, whether it was Fadil Diggs from Texas A&M and most notably Kyle McCord from Ohio State. He comes in, has a tremendous year. So the net portal rating for Fran Brown was a 1 because, yes, while he lost guys in numbers, he upgraded in quality. That's why the portal rating on a scale of 1 to 10 is at a 1, man. It was a great, great job there in the first month and change of his tenure to go out and make sure that the roster overall had more top to bottom talent. And then you kind of carry over some of the momentum created on the recruiting trail onto the year one record of 10-3. Pretty amazing. Okay. What I like most is not only did they figure out a way to improve their quality of player, but they also established a clear offensive identity that is going to lean very heavily towards throwing the ball over the yard, which is going to be really appealing to other quarterbacks and other weapons that are going to be looking for maybe a new opportunity, whether that's coming out of high school or in the transfer portal. After what happened for Kyle McCord, how can you not be at least somewhat intrigued by the opportunity to go play for Fran Brown and this offense that's going to put the quarterback in great position? Kyle McCord led the nation in passing with 370 yards a game. That was 20 yards per game more than the next closest quarterback. They also had some really good wins. You go and you knock off Ohio. Ohio went on to win the MAC championship. You go and you knock off Mountain West runner-up UNLV, one of just a couple of losses for UNLV in the regular season. They won a lot of close games as well. They were 7-2 in games that were decided by one possession. So the best part is, if that's not enough for you, they knock off Miami in the final game of the regular season, finishing the biggest comeback in school history, down 3 touchdowns, and they rally to win 42-38 at home, and they recorded just their second 10-win season since 2001. Year one grade, A+. No doubt about it for Fran Brown. Look, their schedule was relatively manageable, but guess what? He took care of business. And with the big opportunities that he had to play on a big setting against a Miami team that had everything to play for to knock them off, that took this from an A or an A- to an A+. That win by itself tells you all you need to know. Indiana and Curt Cignetti are next. When they hired Curt Cignetti, everyone knows the line. I win, just Google me. That was great, and it was a fun thing to point to over the course of the season, especially as they just continue to win and win and win. We're not there yet, but let's at least talk about what the reaction was when they hired Curt Cignetti. Well, he's been at a lot of places, but can he do it at this level? Like, we've seen him do it at James Madison. We've seen him do it in the FCS. We saw him do it at IUP and at Elon. But can he do it? can he really do it in the Big Ten? That's a huge step up, right? Well, not only did he do it, but he passed every test with flying colors. He was universally respected when he was hired, but there was a real question as to whether or not he'd be able to make that leap, and he did so in the first year with tremendous success. He did lose a lot of guys in the portal. That was something that I think might have been planned by the staff. Hey, it's fine. We can lose those guys. That's all right. We can lose those guys because guess what? Kind of like what Deion said the year before. I'm bringing my own luggage and it's Louis. Well, that's exactly what Curt Cignetti did with this roster. He brought a bunch of guys with him from James Madison. He brought in 30 guys in the transfer portal, several of which have multiple years of college experience, highly productive players. Now, maybe they don't always fit the mold of a Power 5 or NFL starter, but he's got a lot of guys that I don't care if D'Angelo Pons is 5'9", the guy produces at a high level. So we'll take him. I don't care if this guy is maybe only 6 foot as opposed to 6'4". Doesn't matter. This guy can play at a high level in CJ West. So they go out, they get Curtis Rourke, the Ohio quarterback. He has a great year in this offense that is predicated heavily on RPO and being accurate on the downfield throws. Elijah Surratt from James Madison, wide receiver. What a year he had. Mikal Kamara, defensive end, goes on to become an all Big Ten player. CJ West, unbelievable defensive tackle, transfer from Kent State. Yes, they had a couple Power 5 transfers like Justice Ellison from Wake Forest, but for the most part, he took a group of 5 players that could produce, and then they were able to elevate and knock off what was a relatively manageable Big Ten schedule. So you got to give a lot of credit where credit is due. I'm going to put the net portal for Indiana at a 2 because they did lose more than they brought in, but what they brought in was a ton of experience and a ton of comfort playing in the offensive and defensive systems that they were trying to run. And then year 1, 11-2 record. Amazing. To bring in that many impact transfers, there was really hardly any hiccups whatsoever. They outscored their opponents 537 to 203. That was third best in the country. The only 2 teams that were better, Ohio State and Notre Dame, those 2 teams were competing for the national championship. That was their first ever 10-win season. They went 11-1. Their first ever college football playoff appearances. That's obvious, considering the best season they ever had was 9 wins. They had 6 teams that had won 8 games in a year. That was about the best they'd ever had, right? Including 2019, which wasn't that far ago. So to take them from a team that at best could get to 8, maybe 9, to now elevate them to 11 in his first year is pretty remarkable. And I think that a lot of people should feel pretty confident about the direction that this program is going to continue to head under Curt Cignetti's leadership. Year 1 grade, just like Fran Brown, it's an A+. Moving on, as we now will evaluate Kalen DeBoer, the head coach of the Alabama Crimson Tide. The big reaction when he got the job was, man, how do you replace a legend in Nick Saban? I mean, this is a really tough job. He's never coached in the South. He's never been around the South. Will he be able to recruit? Will he be able to go out and get top-tier talent? Like, we know he can put together an offensive and defensive game plan. We saw what he did with the talented Washington team and how he took them to the next level. We saw how he continued to develop Michael Penix and how really the guy ascended so quickly in the college football world. But part of the reason why he ascended as quickly as he did, because look at how many games he won. The guy was always overachieving based on what he had and based on the coaching that his team received. He's a down-to-earth guy. I think a guy that's very approachable. But this was a significant uptick in scrutiny and the microscope that he would have to operate under. So while everybody praised the hire for sure, there was a certain level of skepticism as to whether or not his familiarity with the SEC would have somewhat of an impact on the way his team performed. And then the portal opened up, and the portal was very difficult for Alabama last year. They lost 31 guys in the portal. And who can blame some of these guys, several of which decided to go in? They had signed up to play for Nick Saban. When Nick Saban left, it was a mass exodus, and it was really, really tough. And they lost some of their best players. Caleb Downs, who became an All-American at Ohio State, maybe the best player on Ohio State's defense last year that was first in the country. He leaves. Isaiah Bond leaves, goes to become a go-to guy at Texas at wide receiver. They also lose Amari Niblack at tight end to Texas. They lose Trey Amos, who would have been a starter, one of the best corners in the SEC, would have started at Bama. He goes to Ole Miss and becomes a star. They lose Ja'Cory Brooks, who was Louisville's wide receiver that made a lot of big plays for the Cardinals this past year. And they also lose Seth McLaughlin, who went on to win the Remington as the best center in college football. So they lost a ton. That's not even all of them, by the way. They lost 31 guys in the portal, and nobody wants to focus on that right now. Nobody wants to address, the depth on this Alabama roster, and the quality that was on this Alabama roster is different from that of a team that was competing for championships regularly between 2009 and 2021. The depth was very, very different. They did go out and they gained some guys that really made a huge impact. They gained 31, they gained 11, but to lose 31 is a pretty big undertaking to try to overcome. They did bring in Parker Brailsford. The center has been terrific. LT Overton was great as an edge presence defensively for their defense. Damani Jackson, at corner, amazing. Keon Sabb, prior to him breaking his foot against Tennessee, incredible. So the net portal for Alabama going into last year was 9. I told you earlier, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being, we actually improved in the portal, 10 being, man, we lost a lot in the portal. We got very little left. I think Alabama was a 9. I think their portal turnover was that significant, especially when it came down to the depth. And then the first year started. That was a 9-4 record for Kalen DeBoer. And there were some challenges, some adjustments, some roster tinkering that were very difficult. I think that they were remarkably inconsistent from start to finish. Almost on a week-to-week basis, you'd watch them, you'd say, wow, I mean, that's the way it's supposed to look. And then you'd watch them and be like, my goodness, what was that? Right? There were levels of inconsistency that were really hard to wrap your head around. I think back to the first game, Western Kentucky, the performance in that game, the dominance in that game, and then a couple weeks later to see how they played against South Florida, or a week later how they played against South Florida. Awful against South Florida. Then they played against Wisconsin on the road. Man, they were amazing. And then they get a bye week, and then they hammered Georgia, even though it was dicey in the second half. Really impressive offensive performance, was it not? And then the wheels fall off defensively against Vanderbilt, up against South Carolina, up against Missouri, down against Tennessee, up against LSU. Oh, here they go. They're going to finish strong. Down against Oklahoma. It was just constantly a roller coaster, and that is something that is going to be very important for this staff to try to iron out as they continue to move forward. I do think the bowl loss was one that is more difficult to get over than I think a lot of people are probably giving it credit. Look, the bowl games are bowl games at this point, but had he won the bowl game against Michigan, I think this could have taken this grade into a different level. I also think you need to look at the penalties and you need to look at the amount of scrutiny that this team is naturally always going to receive. But overall year one grade for Kalen DeBoer, I'm giving him a B-. I think it was better than people realize, especially when you take into account how bad the portal was for the Crimson Tide last year. The amount of great players they lost, the amount of depth they lost, and the amount of youth they had to rely on this roster, still getting 9 wins, I think is something to be commended. But the inconsistent performance and the subpar performance against Oklahoma and Vanderbilt is just too much to overcome. So a B-, C+ feels about right for Kalen DeBoer in his first year. Moving over to Duke, where Manny Diaz took over what was, I think, a pretty good situation. Look, Mike Elko did a great job, and as a result was rewarded with the head coaching job at Texas A&M. But when Manny Diaz was hired, everyone was able to kind of wrap their head around and say, okay, well, he's got Power 5 experience, having been the head coach at Miami, and he also comes from that defensive background that we just used in success with Mike Elko. So it kind of made sense. And as a result, I was a little surprised, to be honest with you. I was a little surprised that Manny Diaz took this one because he was in a good situation at Penn State, but he clearly saw something that the rest of us didn't see, and that was an opportunity to get the 9 wins in year number 1. He also lost quite a bit in the portal. They lose 15 guys in the portal, including Riley Leonard, who goes and leads Notre Dame to the national championship game, but he went out and he picked up 16 guys in the portal. So the net portal for Manny Diaz in year number 1 was a 5. It didn't lose a lot, but also didn't gain a lot either. It was about the same. The year 1 record at 9-4 is pretty dang impressive. For Diaz to walk into a situation where the team had gone 15-9 under Mike Elko, but they were losing their quarterback and they were losing a bunch of other talented players, thought it was going to be a pretty tough spot to be in. Because Duke has not been a program that has long been able to sustain success. They've had it in spots, and there have been times when they've won a bunch of games, but for all intents and purposes, Duke is one of those places where you can go from 9-4 to 3-9 in an instant. You also, based on how things can go right now in college football, you can go from 3-9 to the playoff, just like we saw Indiana do this past year. So it is possible to have the upward trajectory, but given what he was stepping into, I think it would have been easier for it to fall off a cliff, and it didn't. Duke has been a program, by the way, that has recorded 3 straight winning seasons just one time since 1957. That happened under David Cutcliffe, who obviously things fell off there at the end of his tenure. They did a great job taking care of business against in-state teams. They beat North Carolina. They beat NC State. They beat Wake Forest. That was the first time they beat all 3 in one season since 2013. And they were great in one-score games. They were 6-1 in games that were decided by a single score. And they were this close to knocking off SMU. Remember, they forced 6 turnovers against SMU, which is still mind-blowing. How you force 6 turnovers and don't win is remarkable in and of itself. So for Manny Diaz, his year 1 grade is A-. I thought it was a great first year for him in Durham, North Carolina. The guy that he replaced, Mike Elko, takes over at Texas A&M. And I think a lot of people, self-included, looked at his hire and thought, that's safe, right? That's safe. That's stable. He's going to be able to provide structure to a program that felt like it was sometimes in disarray under Jimbo Fisher. Fair or unfair, it just felt like Mike Elko is just a rock solid hire. Maybe not super splashy. Maybe you're not going to dominate the press conference, but man, you are going to be on a rock solid foundation for the foreseeable future because he's detail oriented. He's smart. He's been there before. He has familiarity with the program. He's got support within the program. And I think there was a lot of things that would work in his favor. And it did early on in the season. Now, there are still things that they need to figure out. But all in all, the portal last year was not really kind to Texas A&M. They lost some major difference makers. They lose Walter Nolan to Ole Miss. They lose their wide receiver, Evan Stewart, to Oregon, both of which went on to have big-time moments at times for their new team this past year. But they didn't strike out in the portal either. They actually gained 22 in the portal. So they lose 22, they gain 22. So it was kind of a toss-up. But the net portal, they lost a little more than they gained, I think, as far as their quality is concerned. So their net portal was a 6 to me. They lost a little more than they gained, but not to the point where I'm signaling an alarm. Their year 1 record was 8-5. Through the first half of the season, even almost the first 2/3 of the season, he's in the conversation for National Coach of the Year. All right, so you lose to Notre Dame week 1, then you rally, man. Things looked really good. For A&M, they're at the midway point. You get the win against LSU. You're thinking, man, sky high, and then things kind of falter down the stretch. They lost their last 4 games against Power 4 opponents. They finished 8-5, and you look at kind of where they're at. There was a lot to like with what they did defensively. I think there was progress made at times on that side of the ball, but offensively, they're going to have to find something out. Now, a quarterback change mid-year is not easy. Colin Klein, coming down from Kansas State, a little bit unfamiliar maybe with the SEC, how much man teams will play in the SEC. So he's going to be a guy, I think, and I know Colin Klein and have been around Colin Klein. I think he'll figure it out. I'm not worried about where they're going to be long term. I just think when you adjust on the fly the way they did, it's going to be hard to have a great identity created offensively. especially when you're going against teams like Texas and you're going against teams like Notre Dame. Those are great defenses. It's going to be hard to move the ball against them to begin with. It's especially hard to move the ball against them. We don't have a clear and established identity. Their year one grade at Texas A&M, I'm going to give it a rock solid B. You're probably thinking that's too generous. No, I think it's about right because there were a lot of things to like. There was no drop off. They lost quite a bit in the portal. There was not major drop off, and there were some really positive moments throughout the year. Knocking off LSU the way they knocked off LSU was encouraging. Losing to Texas the way that you lose to Texas, really discouraging. So I did not like the finish, but I do think the start warrants a B grade for Mike Elko in his first year. Jedd Fisch took over a Washington program that was on the heels of a national championship appearance. It felt like an impossible situation, by the way. Kalen DeBoer leaves, takes the Alabama head job. Washington really only has one way to go. So not only did they lose a ton of key players, Jedd Fisch takes over a job that, all right, you're moving into the Big Ten. That's impossible. Your coach just left for Alabama. That's impossible. You just got to the national championship. That's impossible. You're going to lose a bunch of guys in the portal. That's impossible. And you're going to have to go and replace Rome Odunze, Michael Penix, and all the great players that comprised that national championship runner-up team. So he stepped into a really tough spot, but people looked at it and said, all right, well, hang on. The spot that he's stepping into there at Washington is tough, but it's probably not as hard as the spot that he stepped in at Arizona. And well, he goes and gets the Arizona job. Within a couple of years, he takes them to 10 wins. Pretty impressive, right? So you thought maybe it wouldn't be as challenging in year one for Jedd Fisch in Seattle as it was in Tucson, but they lost quite a bit in the portal. They lose Parker Brailsford, the center, to Alabama. They lose Jabbar Muhammad to Oregon to become a starting corner for them. You lose Jeremy Bernard to Alabama, the wide receiver. They did go out in the portal. They tried to backfill some of those pieces. You go and get Damon Williams from Arizona. You get Will Rogers at Mississippi State to help bridge the gap. So there were some positive pieces added in the portal. So the net portal for Washington really wasn't that bad. It was actually just a 6. But the graduates from the year before, the guys who exhausted their eligibility or the guys that decided to declare early, that was where some of the biggest vacancies and the biggest challenges were felt. And it led to a 6-7 year one record, which feels like a pretty significant drop. From playing in the national championship game to finishing under 500, you have to also account for the fact, man, this was a completely different team in a completely different league. They lost almost all their starters from 2023. They had very few guys that were there the year before. They did get a jump start with Damon Williams late in the season at quarterback by starting him down the stretch. He showed us some potential in the Sun Bowl against Louisville. I thought he had some positive moments against Oregon. So there were some things to like about Jedd Fisch's first season, but the consistency wasn't quite there. And I do believe that the second year and the third year will be much better indicators of long-term success that he could have there at Seattle. I'll give his year one grade a B-. Moving on to UCLA, who tapped DeShaun Foster to become their next head coach. There was a lot of kind of speculation when DeShaun Foster got the job. Well, Chip Kelly abruptly decides to leave and takes not a lateral move, but what many believe to be a downward move from head coach in the Big Ten to coordinator in the Big Ten. It was a bit of a surprise. I think a bit of a shock. So when Chip Kelly decided to leave, I think people looked and said, oh my goodness, like we need to find somebody that is going to bring us a little enthusiasm, a little excitement, a guy that we can rally behind, a guy that will lead us through the doldrums. And that was DeShaun Foster. So there was some speculation, but it was really less about DeShaun Foster and more about the future of UCLA's program when he got the job. Man, if a head coach is willing to leave for a coordinator job in the same league, like what does that say about the commitment level of the Bruins? I think there was something to be said about that. Well, I think DeShaun Foster did a pretty adequate job, by the way, steadying the ship, made a couple of splashy coordinator hires. He also lost his defensive coordinator to in-state and in-city rival USC, which was never going to be easy when Danton Lynn decided to go across town. So that was tough as well. I think they kind of weathered the storm and they came out of it the other side. Look, they lost 14 in the portal. They gained 14 in the portal. I do think in some ways they got a little deeper in some areas in the portal. So I put their net portal last year at a 4. 5 being even, 4 being slightly improved based on their portal performance. And of course, I feel like it was decent. They lost a couple good players, but nothing that was irreplaceable, if you will. Year 1, 5-7. If you want me to be completely honest, that's better than I thought. I thought this team was going to be like a 3-win team at best. Then they started 1-5, really, really difficult opening stretch. And at that point, you're starting to think, this is not going to go well. This is not good. And then Foster continued to get the guys to buy in. Guys continued to stay engaged, continued to work, and continued to try to get better. They all of a sudden start reeling off a couple wins. They beat Rutgers. They beat Nebraska. They beat Iowa. Two of those wins were on the road. And then, other than the Big Ten opener against Indiana, they were somewhat competitive, even in losing effort. We don't like to give out participation trophies, but when you take into account the level of negativity that was surrounding UCLA when DeShaun Foster took over, to be in the mix and to fight the way they fought, you have to feel pretty good about where they could be going here in the future. Now, they overhauled the staff. That's going to be interesting to see where that goes. Hopefully, that will lead to more continuity amongst the staff. But all in all, given what preseason expectations were and what the results were, I'm going to give year 1 for DeShaun Foster a B. Yes, Big Ten media days notwithstanding, that was not a B+ or B performance, but the season as a whole, pretty good in year number 1 in the Big Ten. Willie Fritz is the head coach of Houston, and when he was hired, everyone cited it as a slam dunk. I mean, because I think Willie Fritz is a guy that has long been overlooked, has had opportunities in the past, was this close to potentially becoming the head coach at Georgia Tech, had been contacted in the past, but it just never really happened for him. So for him to take Houston, man, I was sitting there thinking like, all right, here we go. This could be really intriguing. So Houston's got deep resources. They have deep pockets. They're in the Big 12, so it felt regionally like a good fit. I'm pretty optimistic about where this could go. And they lose as many guys as they lost in the portal, and it was brutal. They lost 25 guys in the portal last year, including Matthew Golden, who became a star for the Texas Longhorns. Jamari Caldwell, who's a defensive tackle there for Oregon, had a great year. Sam Brown went to Miami, had a great year. Tyler Johnson went to Colorado as an offensive lineman, had a good year. They lost a lot of really quality pieces in the portal last year. Now, they went and added 21 guys, but they weren't able to replace the level of potential with the guys that they lost. So the net portal for Houston going into last year was a 7. 7 being like they lost an awful lot, and it's going to be impossible, not impossible, but nearly impossible to replace. So this was a team that was very much in transition, and they led to a 4-8 record in year number 1. They did get off to a really bad start, not that dissimilar to UCLA. At 1-4, things were not looking very good. They kind of flipped the script there at the midway point by winning 3 of their next 4, including a win on the road at TCU, and then you upset Kansas State. But it's the offense. The offense that was the big problem all season long. They scored just 31 total points in their final 3 games. They lost all 3 of those games. So they played well enough on defense to at least get to the postseason potentially. They were top 25 in what they did defensively, but offensively, it was really, really bad. They were one of the worst in the country in scoring 14 points a game. So I think if they can figure out something on offense, they have a real chance here in the future to get things turned around. I will give you this sliver of optimism if you're a Houston fan. Willie Fritz went 4-8 in his first year at Tulane. And then in his final couple of years, he wins 23 games. So we've seen this happen before. Maybe just takes him a second. This guy's proven. He's a veteran guy. He's won a lot of games. So I think Willie Fritz will ultimately get it turned around, but year 1 was not great. I'm going to give it a C in year number 1. Mississippi State and Jeff Lebby, they had an interesting season. Now, we knew the offense was going to be exciting. That was the reaction when Jeff Lebby got the job. Well, he's going to score, but what will things look like on the defensive side? If anything, he's going to put together a really compelling and exciting product for Mississippi State fans. That was the reason why he was hired. That's what they said when they hired him. Like, hey, he's going to score points. It's going to be fun to watch. Yeah, it was too. There were a lot of things that were fun to watch last year with Mississippi State. They lost a lot in the portal. They lost 26 guys in the portal. They only brought in 15. A couple of those guys they brought in were pretty good. They bring in Kevin Coleman from Louisville, ends up having a great year at wide receiver. You bring in Blake Shapen, Baylor quarterback, who gets hurt in the fourth game, but showed promise in those first few. But some of the pieces that you lost, like Xavier Thomas to LSU, Woody Marks, running back to USC, just too big of a void to fill in. Their net portal was about a 6, so they lost a little bit more than they brought in, and their first-year record was just 2-10. It wasn't great. It was about where a lot of people expected them to be, at least in the SEC. They were picked to finish 15th out of 16. So it's not a massive surprise that they went just 2-10. They had a massive overhaul offensively with what they brought into the portal. They lose their quarterback. They had a really difficult schedule that included a trip to Georgia, a trip to Texas, Tennessee, and Ole Miss. They faced 5 teams that were ranked in the top 15 at the time of their matchup. They went winless in the SEC for the first time in 22 years, and they were outscored 311 to 169 in league games. So there's a lot of room for growth, but I think had they kept it healthy, had they not lost Blake Shapen, maybe things would have looked a little bit different. I don't know. Either way, it was not a great start. Losing to Toledo the way they did, losing to Arizona State the way they did, not great. But really tough schedule and almost impossible to get a feel for where this team could go here in the future. Year one, not a success, though. I'll give it a C for Jeff Lebby in year one. Michigan took the interim tag off of Sherrone Moore. Well, he had the interim for about 6 games, filling in for Jim Harbaugh. And I think it made sense. I mean, you really couldn't go anywhere else when this coaching search was going on. Sherrone Moore had served as the coach the previous year when they won the national championship for 6 of the team's 15 games. So for them to beat Ohio State, to beat Penn State with him patrolling the sideline kind of tells you all you need to know. Like, the guy had to be the head coach. And you thought, hey, there's going to be some reasons why this could pay off. The portal went down. It wasn't great for them. They lost 17 guys in the portal, including Keon Sabb to Alabama. At that point, by the time they were able to enter the portal, there weren't that many options because they were playing all the way up until the national championship. And by the time they were in the market for the portal and Jim Harbaugh decides to leave and they bring in Sherrone Moore, the portal was only had like 3 or 4 teams in it. So Ja'Shawn Barnum, they brought him from Maryland, which is a good ad, but the net portal for Michigan was a 6. The big problem wasn't so much the portal, it was the amount of departures off a team that was very veteran laden that won the national championship. Their year one record was 8-5. And I'm not sure there was a coach that improved their grade more in the final few weeks of the regular season than Sherrone Moore, because nobody anticipated them being back in the college football. At least I didn't. I told you in the preseason, we talked about it in the preseason. I didn't think Michigan was going to have a great year. They just lost too many pieces. They also had too much uncertainty with the quarterback situation. You got to replace J.J. McCarthy. They didn't go out. They didn't get a transfer quarterback to replace him. I didn't think Alex Orji was going to be the answer. I wasn't sure what the circumstances were going to be with their quarterback spot, but I did not anticipate that level of regression offensively. They were 130th in the country in passing. The only teams that were behind them were the 3 service academies. And some of the decisions that were made by Sherrone Moore throughout the year, he didn't ace the test, but it was far from flawless, but it was far from majorly flawed as well. They killed Northwestern. They finally get some momentum. They get some confidence going. And then they shock Ohio State and Columbus as a massive underdog. At this point, he can do no wrong, right? He can do no wrong. You just beat Ohio State. Ohio State's about to go win the national championship. You just knocked them off in Columbus. Like, doesn't get any better than that. Well, you make things a little better by beating Alabama in the ReliaQuest Bowl, which only continued some of the momentum. Then you had a great recruiting class, which doesn't factor in here. But all things considered, man, with where I thought this grade was going to be compared to where it ended up, pretty remarkable turnaround there down the stretch for Sherrone Moore. I give his first year a B+. It was far from flawless, like I said, but still very, very solid. And I'm telling you, man, this thing might have been a C prior to the Ohio State game. Prior to the Ohio State game, prior to the Alabama game, it might have been a C. But to flip the script and to finish 8-5 when it looked like the wheels were coming off, that's a really impressive job by Sherrone Moore in his first year. Moving on to Boston College, who brought in, I think, a home run name in the New England area by bringing in Bill O'Brien, who had been with the Patriots for multiple years, had been their offensive coordinator. Felt like because of some of the he'd been a head coach in college football, had been a head coach in the NFL, had worked for Nick Saban. Like, he checked a lot of boxes for Boston College. This was a slam dunk, and it was a no-brainer. And it was pretty impressive, I think, in year number one to see already what they were able to go and get. Yeah, they lost 16 guys in the portal. They only brought in 9. But if you look at on 247, guys 1 through 25 that were listed, the top 7 players that they brought in were all incoming. 7 players involved in the portal were all incoming. So their net portal this past season was 3. Yeah, they lost a few pieces. They lost more than they brought in, but the quality that they brought in was better than that of what they lost. So net portal ranking was 3, and year one record of 7-6 was pretty impressive. Look, Bill O'Brien knows what he's doing. He's run a team in the past. He's been around for a while. He understands the college level. He understands the professional level. He also understands the quarterback position. So it got off to a pretty good start. You get a win against Florida State. You get a win against Michigan State. You do lose to Missouri there in the first 5 games of the year, but you're in a pretty good spot. And then things started to come unraveled a little bit. They lose 3 in a row. They ultimately have to make a decision to go from Thomas Castellanos to Grayson James, which I don't think was a super popular decision at the time, but one that Bill O'Brien stood by, and it was a difficult decision to make, but it appears, based on how things went down the stretch, it appears like it was the right decision for Bill O'Brien. James led Boston College to wins over Syracuse, North Carolina, and Pitt down the stretch to cap off what was a pretty good first season there for BC. Bill O'Brien's year one grade is an A-. I think he did a great job stepping in for kind of a somewhat difficult situation, upgrading their talent, stabilizing the situation, and pulling off some big wins in a little bit of a roller coaster type of season. Finally, last but certainly not least, it's Jonathan Smith. How did he do in his first year at Michigan State? Although, hey, look, 44 years old when he got the job, had never really been out of the Pacific Northwest. He was kind of, I think, one of the hires of the offseason. Extremely well respected, had a clear and established identity. A guy that was being heavily pursued by a bunch of different places. And Michigan State kind of getting out to the front and getting him before anyone else could really go and have a conversation was very, very impressive. And it showed, hey, they must have sold Jonathan Smith on something. Jonathan Smith was going to have some options at his disposal. So a couple portal departures. You lose 33 guys in the portal. You lose Derek Harmon to Oregon. You lose Simeon Barrow to Miami. Both are defensive linemen. You lose Sam Leavitt to Arizona State, who has now become a starting quarterback and one of the best quarterbacks in the country. They did, however, go into the portal and bring in a bunch of good players. You bring in a couple guys from Oregon State, most notably Aiden Childs, the quarterback, who started for them this past season. Their net portal, based on what they lost, though, was pretty significant. They lost a lot of really good pieces. They lost 8. I think they lost, I put their net portal at an 8. So I think it was, if you look at what was lost versus what was brought in, there was a lot of really high quality people, especially along the lines of scrimmage. A lot of offensive linemen that left, a lot of defensive linemen that left. You lose Sam Leavitt as a quarterback who goes on to have a great year and takes Arizona State to the playoff. I think their net portal was an 8 last year, which makes, I'm not saying it makes the 5-7 record feel better, but it helps put into perspective why this team went 5-7. Now, first year, it wasn't great, okay? Especially the way things ended for him. The final 4 games of the year to get blown out in 3 different games is not ideal. And to score 0 points in the second half against Purdue when you barely survive, and Purdue at this point, not very good whatsoever. It was not a good finish to the season. November was not kind. But they did get a good home win against Iowa. They kept things, I think, competitive against Michigan in Ann Arbor. But there were a lot of games in which you just wanted more from their offense. 123rd nationally in scoring Aiden Childs had a very up and down season, completed less than 60% of his passes, turned the ball over way too much. So we've got to get the best out of Aiden Childs moving forward. But first year, it's about what I expected, especially taking into account the net portal performance that Michigan State had. So I'm giving Jonathan Smith in his first year a B-. All right, one other item of note, and we will put all of these coordinator hires into a show and we'll break these things down in their entirety. But this is one that kind of shook up the landscape. So it is worth discussing here as we put a bow on our January 27th edition of Always College Football. Jim Knowles, the offensive coordinator of Ohio State, defensive coordinator of Ohio State, has left to become the defensive coordinator of Penn State. And man, it was an aggressive move by Penn State. It feels like Penn State's kind of going all in this year, doesn't it? A little bit like Ohio State last year, a little bit like Michigan the year before. Penn State, I think, recognizes the opportunity and the uncertainty at a lot of different places, whether it's Ohio State, Notre Dame, Oregon. A lot of teams have a bunch of turnover, and Penn State's like, we have a lot of guys back. Let's go all in. They go throw $3.1 million a year at Jim Knowles for him to come in and to become their third defensive coordinator in the last handful of years. It started with Manny Diaz. Manny Diaz was rewarded with the head coaching job at Duke and did a great job, not just at Penn State, but also at Duke this past year. And then it was Tom Allen. Tom Allen had a great year at Penn State. He goes and gets a lucrative job there at Clemson, where he's back coaching defense, same situation, same spot, but coaching it there for the Clemson Tigers. They kind of had to go get somebody. They had to go get one of the best available, and they do. A guy that led Ohio State to the number one overall defense last year. He made $2.2 million last year. Now, they did incorporate some bonuses, so he made nearly $3 million with the national championship. But to now take his base salary to 3.1, to give him slight escalators over the next few years, and to give him a 3-year contract with a pretty decent sized buyout is pretty impressive. But a guy just allowed less than 13 points a game. Pretty impressive. So I love the hire here for Penn State, but it definitely gives off the vibe that they are going all in. And like I said, we will break down all the different coaching carousel moves here at some point on a future episode of Always College Football. So we'll be locked in right here. We'll be back a little later in the week. We'll be back on Thursday. We'll break a bunch of stuff down. We'll give you the news and notes, what's going on this weekend, but submit some questions because we want to start getting into the mailbag. You can always send your questions to our social media feeds at AlwaysCFB on both Instagram and on Twitter. So you can submit questions there, just at AlwaysCFB. Submit the question. We'll answer it here on Always College Football. Another place where you can also submit questions, that is via our ESPN College Football YouTube comment section. So if you submit questions into the comment section of this episode, we will answer some of those questions a little later in the week. So let's tap in and let's answer some questions that you might have on where we're going here in the college football world. We love you guys. We appreciate you guys. And for all of us here at Always College Football, from Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an amazing day. And remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.